Is there any system that protects PhD candidates from having a problematic supervisor? For example, any ways to make complaints, or would complaints not help but make the relationship worse? So the simple answer is yes. Usually there are ways to make formal complaints. And my view is that universities and supervisors have a responsibility to provide support, feedback, and guidance to PhD students. There's a trust that you place in them when you invest years of your life and possibly quite a lot of money in tuition fees, and they have a duty to provide adequate support in return. If you're not receiving that support, you've got to be assertive. You've got to speak up, and you've got to speak up early while there's still time to find a potential solution, rather than waiting until the last few months of your PhD when it might be too late. If you don't say anything because you're afraid of their reaction, there will probably be much worse consequences later. However, as you rightly point out, making a formal complaint to the university or to your department is likely to affect your relationship with your supervisor. And I think it's always best to try to resolve any issues directly with your supervisor, and formal complaints should really only be used as a last resort if you've made every reasonable attempt to sort things out, but the working relationship has completely broken down. At that point, it doesn't really matter how they react because the relationship is already dead. So, how should you try to address problems in your relationship with your PhD supervisor? So the original question doesn't specify what the problem is. So I'll go through a few common issues and how you might be able to approach them. So the first common problem is simply a lack of contact. This is especially common if you're doing a PhD remotely and you're entirely dependent on email for communication. Now, sometimes this isn't entirely the supervisor's fault. Often I speak to students who say they emailed the supervisor 3 months ago but didn't get a reply. And then they can get stuck in a cycle of worry about what that means, about whether the supervisor cares about the project or whether the work they sent was good enough. But then when I ask if they've tried to follow up, often they say they're afraid of appearing rude, or they don't want to disturb their supervisor because they're so busy and important. But remember that academics struggle too. The day your email arrived, maybe they had 100 other emails in their inbox. Maybe they had a grant application deadline. Maybe they were about to reply to you and someone knocked on their door. And maybe they fully intended to get back to you, and because they wanted to give you a considered reply, they didn't do it in the moment, and then it just slid further down their inbox. So personally, I try to stay on top of my email, but sometimes things slip and it doesn't mean anything that I haven't replied, and it's helpful to me if you follow up on a message that I haven't replied to. So try not to project your fears onto your supervisor. Assume good intentions and just send a polite follow-up. If they consistently don't reply, then yes, that's a problem. And what I would do is say to them that you would really value their input and ask whether it would be possible to have more frequent contact, and also whether there's something that you can do to make that easier. And if there's still no response, or if they say no, or if they get angry, this is when you might consider trying to change supervisor. Problem number 2. So you might have more than one supervisor, and maybe they aren't communicating with each other, or maybe they're giving you contradictory advice. In this case, it's your responsibility to manage the communication, making sure that they're both copied into emails and they each know what the other has said. It's also worth noting that often supervisors are giving you suggestions, and it's up to you to decide what to do with them. They will want you to have counter suggestions. They will want you to have your own ideas. and they will want you to make decisions. So perhaps instead of seeing it as contradictory advice, maybe try to see it as a range of options that you can try or even modify to come up with another option of your own. Then, in your communication with both supervisors, you can say what you're going to try first and give your reasoning for that. Problem number 3. What if your supervisor keeps giving you really harsh feedback? This can be difficult to take, especially if you've put a lot of work in and you're feeling a bit stressed. So there's often an emotional component that can sometimes affect the way that you interpret feedback, and it can make you feel demotivated and disengaged. Now, when you were an undergraduate and you submitted an essay, you probably just received a grade and moved on. You weren't expected to make any changes. But at PhD level, you're learning to be a professional academic. And when professional academics submit a paper, unless they submit to a low quality journal that just accepts anything, there will almost always be things that they have to change in response to the reviewer's comments. And that's actually a good result, because a lot of the best journals completely reject the majority of submissions. So I can guarantee that your supervisor, no matter how good their publication record, will have had work rejected, and they will have had harsh feedback. It's not a personal judgment, it's just part of the job, and it's necessary to improve your work and your writing. So what I'd suggest is really trying to engage with the feedback, possibly just one section at a time to make it a little bit easier, and making sure that you really understand the points they're making and asking them to clarify if necessary. So one of the biggest frustrations I hear from PhD supervisors is when students don't say anything. Most supervisors would want you to ask questions. They would want you to tell them if there's something you don't understand, and they would want you to discuss a point that you disagree with. So try to become an active participant in your feedback rather than a passive recipient. And for more on this point, check out my video on dealing with harsh feedback, which I'll link to up here and in the description below. Problem number 4. So sometimes I hear from students who want to study one thing, but the supervisor's interests lie elsewhere, and they want the student to do something else. The ideal situation would be that the supervisor is curious enough to learn a bit about the subject and secure enough in their own position to help you find other people who can help you where they can't. That doesn't always happen, and I've heard about supervisors refusing to read or engage with work they aren't expert in, or even situations where they have a really deep personal opposition to the kind of work you want to do. If that's the case, if your interests simply don't align, don't waste any more of your time. Change supervisor or leave and go somewhere where you can do the kind of work you want to do. It's not worth spending years of your life in a situation where you and your supervisor are working against each other. So the final and most serious problem is if your supervisor, instead of commenting on your work, attacks you personally. If they yell at you, if they make inappropriate comments, if they put you down in front of other people, or if they respond unprofessionally to any of your attempts at communication, this puts you in a really horrible position, especially because of the imbalance of power between you. Now, it's difficult to know what to do about this. The worry may be that if you speak up, then they'll make life more difficult for you. So you can get stuck in a position where you feel like you can't do anything, but you also can't leave because then you don't get your PhD. And the longer you're in that situation and the more inappropriate treatment you accept, the more difficult it becomes to do anything because it eats away at your confidence and your self-esteem. So if the way that they treat you is truly unacceptable to you, You've got to speak up. And yes, they might react badly. They might get angry. Or perhaps worse, they might turn on the charm and try to make you doubt yourself. But the only power they have over you is your willingness to stay. Or to put it another way, your unwillingness to leave. As soon as you take the position that you can walk away if this particular PhD supervisor is wrong for you, or if the department don't support you when you make a complaint, if you're willing to walk away, then there's nothing they can do to harm you. Now, there are a lot of other potential issues or complications, and there's only so much we can cover in one video. So if you have specific situations or other problems with your supervisor, or just anything else you'd like me to cover, please do leave a comment below. Also, if you'd like to know when I release new videos, you can subscribe on YouTube or head over to my website at phd.academy and sign up for the email list. So that's it from me. Best of luck, and I'll see you next time.